Hello everybody, welcome back to another video, and in today's video, we're going to be simulating a thriving prehistoric desert for 100 days. Will these terrible lizards rule the earth once more, or is it all doomed for extinction? To find out, we have to go back to day 1. On day 1, I started off by introducing the first dinosaurs to our ecosystem, the pachycephalosauruses. Immediately, the Pachycephalosaurus ran to get some water. While the rest of the herd followed along. Meanwhile, on the other side of the island, there was a brand new species making his way, the Gallimimus. While the sun was setting, the Pachycephalosauruses were finding food and a good watering source, for water wasn't too common in these deserts. While the rest of the Pachycephalosaurus herd were making their way towards the new land, these Pachycephalosauruses were communicating. Meanwhile, the Gallimimuses were getting to know each other better and eating food, just like the other Pachycephalosaurids. And just like before, these Pachycephalosauruses were communicating. Morning was approaching, and the Pachycephalosaurus herd was getting breakfast, which luckily was just a few meters away from them. Meanwhile, the Pachycephalosaurus herd was getting water. Meanwhile, the Gallimimus herd were making their way and finding new lands for them to explore. Expanding their territory, if you will. Meanwhile, a brand new species was getting ready to come out into the ecosystem, the Chungkingosaurus. And as most dinosaurs do, the Chungkingosaurus went looking for water immediately. And after that, the Chungkingosaurus went looking for food. Meanwhile, the other Chungkingosauruses were taking a drink of water and relaxing. And it was turning night fast. Meanwhile, the Gallimimuses were doing great as always, and they got into a community gathering. Meanwhile, the Pachycephalosauruses were expanding their territory knowledge. Soon after that, a Pachycephalosaurus had realized that the Chungkingosauruses had taken their food source. He immediately went back to tell the rest of the herd. He had told them that they needed to find a new food source, or soon they were going to starve. Luckily, the pack leader agreed that in the morning they would start their great migration and find a new food source. Three of them scouted out to find a new land, and one went back to get some water. Meanwhile, one of the other Chunkingosaurus got separated from the rest of the herd. The Great Migration was starting for the Pachycephalosauruses, and they were ready to find a new food source. The Pachycephalosaurus that informed them on the issue was the one scouting out for new food. The rest of the herd had no idea how long he would be on. For all they know, it could be a few weeks, a few months, even a few days. Luckily for them, it was just a few minutes, and their new food source was just a mile away. And the rest of the herd was just a few miles back. The Pachycephalosaurus that went scouting out saw them on the horizon and went out to inform them on the good news. They looked at each other and wagged their tails, almost as if the rest of the herd was thanking him. Meanwhile, the Gallimimus herd on the other side of the island were doing great, and there was no threat for them and no issues, and they were just drinking water and eating food. And the Chunkingosaurus still had a member of their herd missing. All the dinosaurs on this side of the island were drinking water, and so were the Pachycephalosauruses, which was well earned, since they've been migrating all day long. Little did they know, the missing Chunkingosaurus finally found his way back. They slowly started walking towards each other, almost as if they were saying, "Where have you been?" As great as this was for the Chunkingosauruses, the Pachycephalosauruses weren't too happy about it, since they were already having trouble with their food source thanks to them. And the Gallimimuses were going to sleep for the night, while the rest scouted around to make sure no predators snuck up on them. Meanwhile, the Pachycephalosaurus was just waking up from a sleep. While the rest of the herd were sleeping for the night, it was morning. And the Pachycephalosaurus made sure they wouldn't sleep in too late. Meanwhile, the first predator of our ecosystem was just on the horizon, the Dilophosaurus. And an entire pack of them, to be exact. And the Dilophosauruses weren't wasting any time to get to the herbivores. These two crested lizards weren't as small as they were depicted to be in Jurassic Park. To be exact, they could grow up to 23 feet long. But that doesn't mean that's their maximum size. This Dilophosaurus had already challenged a Pachycephalosaurus to a fight. But who will win? The Dilophosaurus backed down just in the nick of time, but the other one might not be so lucky. Just like the other, this Dilophosaurus backed down. Later that day, the same Dilophosaurus got in a fight with a different Pachycephalosaurus. The Dilophosaurus backed down once more. It seemed that there was nothing here weak enough for them to take down, which means they will starve. Meanwhile, another Dilophosaurus got into another fight with a Pachycephalosaurus. The Pachycephalosaurus had won, and there were only a few Dilophosauruses remaining, one which had already laid down to die. And the Pachycephalosaurus had won. Now there are only two Dilophosauruses remaining, and as I said before, one is on low health, and the other has laid down to die. The sky was a fiery red, and it seemed all hope was lost for the Dilophosaurus. In order to survive, the Dilophosaurus was eating the other Dilophosaurus that had lost in a battle. Somehow, none of the Dilophosauruses survived through the night, except for one. Meanwhile, something much smaller was arriving. The Compsognathus. The Compy was drinking lots and lots of water. And, as always, the Pachycephalosauruses were doing great. And the same can be said for the Chungkingosauruses. Meanwhile, a Pachycephalosaurus was getting into a fight with a Dilophosaurus, which, as we've seen in the past, probably won't go well for the Dilophosaurus. And the Dilophosaurus lost. And, officially, the Dilophosauruses were extinct. The Compies had made their way to the herbivores, and for the Compies, these small Pachycephalosauruses were giants. and because of this Dilophosaurus's fatal mistake, would let the compies thrive. Usually, this small amount of food would do hardly anything, but for the compies, this would last them weeks. The compies were somehow surviving better and easier than the Dilophosaurus. This Compsognathus was just enjoying a meal when a Chonkingosaurus scared him. The compies had discovered another Dilophosaurus. If only the Dilophosaurus had gotten to the Gallimimus, since they can't defend themselves. Later that night, the Gallimimuses were taking a drink as a herd. It seemed that they weren't separating, which was smart, just to be sure if any predators came soon. It was morning, and everyone had survived just fine. Later that morning, a Gallimimus had been separated from its pack. And the Chonkingosaurus were doing great. And just like the Gallimimus from earlier, there was a Pachycephalosaurus separated from the rest of the herd. Lost, if you will. And he started heading back. He couldn't seem to find a way back home. Luckily, the rest of the herd noticed that he was missing, and they sent one to scout out for him, and they found him. And later that day, it was getting dark. And the Pachycephalosauruses were getting a drink. And the lost Pachycephalosaurus finally found his way back to the watering hole. And later that night, the Chonkingosaurus was getting some food in his body. And the same goes for the Pachycephalosauruses. Meanwhile, the herd of Gallimimuses were exploring. Morning was just on the horizon, and something sinister was about to come. The new apex predator, Herrerasaurus. Unlike most dinosaurs, instead of immediately going for water, he immediately went for the herbivores. And the Herrerasauruses were hunting down the compies. Meanwhile, the other Herrerasauruses were communicating. All 5 Herrerasauruses were making their way towards the herbivores, and the only thing that could come out of this is death. And the compies thrived for a while, but now they're extinct. Later, a Pachycephalosaurus and a Herrerasaurus got in a fight. The Pachycephalosaurus backed down, but what about the other battles going on? And again, two of the Pachycephalosauruses backed down, but what about the last fight? Looks like there's a new top of the food chain, the Herrerasaurus. Meanwhile, the Gallimimuses had a community gathering. The Pachycephalosauruses were severely wounded, perhaps even fatally wounded. The Herrerasaurus had challenged the Pachycephalosaurus to a fight. Neither of the dinosaurs had healed very well, especially the Pachycephalosaurus. The Pachycephalosaurus had lost. This was the first Pachycephalosaurus to die. The rest of the Pachycephalosauruses knew they were in danger and needed to think of a plan. The first dinosaur of our ecosystem has already died. The rest of the Pachycephalosauruses were sad and severely injured. And this Pachycephalosaurus had been challenged to a fight to the death. It seemed that the Pachycephalosauruses were going to go extinct. And another Pachycephalosaurus got into a fight with the apex predator of the ecosystem, the Herrerasaurus. Another Pachycephalosaurus downed. There is only one Pachycephalosaurus left. Will it survive another day? Or fall to the same mistake that the others did? The last Pachycephalosaurus had fallen. They were officially extinct. And later that day, the Gallimimuses, well, were doing great, but not for long. For Herrerasaurus had found their location. And a Herrerasaurus was already getting ready to start hunting. One Gallimimus down, an entire herd to go. The rest of the Herrerasaurus pack was coming to the Gallimimus' location. Another Herrerasaurus was watching the Gallimimuses from a distance. And just because the herd was far doesn't mean they weren't on the Herrerasaurus' menu. There was only a handful of Gallimimuses left, which, honestly, isn't very good for the Herrerasaurus or the Gallimimuses. And the Gallimimuses were just eating and socializing, like everything was normal, but the Herrerasaurus were making their way towards them closer and closer. The herd was getting nervous since they were right behind them. The other Herrerasaurus was staying hidden from the Gallimimus and going underwater. The remaining 3 Gallimimuses were talking over what had just happened. In the morning, one of the 3 got killed. And the same can be said for the second to last Gallimimus. Now there's only 1 remaining. And the last Gallimimus also got killed. And later that day, I introduced the Nasutoceratops. And we needed something to compete with the Herrerasaurus, so I introduced the Proceratosauruses. Later that night, the Proceratosaurus challenged a Herrerasaurus. The Herrerasaurus absolutely demolished the Proceratosaurus. And the same can be said for his friend. Only 1 Proceratosaurus remains. The only way this Proceratosaurus was going to live was by the limited amount of meat from this Gallimimus the Herrerasaurus had killed. And eating the carcasses of, well, his friends. It was morning, and none of the Proceratosauruses had survived the night, except for this one. And the Nasutoceratopses were doing fine. But one of the Nasutoceratopses got separated. And the remaining Proceratosaurus was being stalked by Herrerasaurus. The Nasutoceratops was starting to find his way. And the Herrerasaurus had challenged the very last Proceratosaurus to a fight to the death. And as I assumed, the Proceratosaurus had perished. But on the bright side, the Nasutoceratops has found his way back to his herd. But we needed something stronger to compete with the Herrerasauruses, so I introduced the Velociraptors. The Velociraptor immediately went to go eat the dead Proceratosaurus. Meanwhile, another Velociraptor got into a fight with a Herrerasaurus. And surprisingly, the Velociraptor won. Would this be the end of the Herrerasaurus' legacy? Another vicious Herrerasaurus had died to the small Velociraptor. It seemed the Herrerasaurus was still barely alive, for it was wiggling its fingers, toes, and still moving its jaw and breathing, while a Velociraptor was eating it. Meanwhile, there was a brand new species called the Muttaburrasaurus. Meanwhile, a Herrerasaurus had gotten into a fight with a Velociraptor. The Velociraptor backed down. Later in the morning, the Muttaburrasauruses were doing great, and, well, they were finding good food sources and good water sources. Meanwhile, a Herrerasaurus and a Velociraptor got into a fight. This was the last Herrerasaurus, and it had lost the fight. And the Herrerasauruses were extinct. Or at least that's what I thought. Turns out there was a Herrerasaurus hiding out on the other side of the island with the herbivores. And the Nasutoceratopses and Chunkingosauruses were doing great. And one of the three Muttaburrasauruses had already been killed by a Herrerasaurus. It was nearly nighttime, and the Velociraptors were migrating. And in the night, the Velociraptors made their way to the Muttaburrasauruses. Only one Muttaburrasaurus remains. And there was a Velociraptor separated from the pack while the rest were eating herbivores. Meanwhile, the last Herrerasaurus got into a fight with the Velociraptor. The Herrerasauruses were officially extinct. 100% this time. The Chunkingosauruses and the Velociraptors were taking a drink. Not too long after that, these two Velociraptors were fighting for dominance. And the Velociraptor pack has a new leader. And the Nasutoceratopses were doing great. This one scared off a Velociraptor. And the Chunkingosauruses were doing great. And as of right now, the Chunkingosauruses are the oldest dinosaurs in this desert. And the Nasutoceratopses were in the exact place a few Pachycephalosauruses had died. Now we needed something to compete with the Velociraptors hunting. So I introduced the Deinonychus. Later that night, a velociraptor was chasing a Deinonychus. And in the night, the Deinonychus had already gotten into a fight with a velociraptor. The velociraptor had died. And later in the morning, another Deinonychus and velociraptor had gotten into a battle. The velociraptor had died, and it seemed that there was a new apex predator, the Deinonychus. And this velociraptor had been separated from its pack for almost the entire ecosystem's history. And it was lucky for that, because if it wasn't, it would have died from a Deinonychus. The Deinonychuses were so fierce, they were even scaring away the Noseutoceratopses. And, sadly enough, the last velociraptor was making its way towards the Deinonychuses. But, at least it still had a slight chance of getting food. The velociraptor is in Deinonychus territory, which is dangerous by itself. Meanwhile, there was a brand new species making its way, the Parasaurolophus. The last velociraptor has gotten into a fight with the Deinonychus. The velociraptor had lost. The velociraptors were officially extinct. And, meanwhile, the Parasaurolophuses were communicating. All was peaceful. Until there was a brand new fierce predator, the Allosaurus. All was about to break into chaos. The Allosaurus was making his way towards the herbivores, and it was only a matter of time until the herbivores were no more. The Allosaur had already made his way and was stalking a Noseutoceratops. The Noseutoceratops and the Allosaurus had gotten into a battle to the death. All this time, the Noseutoceratopses have been untouched until the Allosaurus got here. It was morning, and the Noseutoceratops couldn't survive the night. And that morning, a Parasaurolophus had been hunted down by a Deinonychus. And by the end of the day, all the Parasaurolophuses were dead. And the Nasutoceratopses were doing great. They were sad that one of their herd members had died. The dinosaur kingdom needs to be careful because it wasn't the age of herbivores anymore. It was a new era. The era of the carnivores. Later that night, an Allosaurus and a Deinonychus got into a fight. Surprisingly, the Allosaurus backed down. The Nasutoceratops had died. There was only one Nasutoceratops remaining. And because this Nasutoceratops had died, the Deinonychuses would thrive. This was enough food to last them for about a week or two. We needed something to compete with the Allosaurus, so I introduced the Carnotaurus. We were getting close to 100 days, and the Allosaurus has been strong up until this point. But it makes me wonder, will the Carnotaurus come out the apex predator of the ecosystem? The Carnotaurus had already made his way towards the herbivores. And he'd already gotten into a fight with a Chunkingosaurus. The Chunkingosaurus had already died, which just shows the power of the Carnotaurus. The Nasutoceratops was on the run from the Carnotaurus. But the Carnotaurus fell asleep, which allowed the Nasutoceratops to be uncornered. Later that afternoon, I introduced a new ceratopsian, the Triceratops. Later in the day, a Carnotaurus got into a fight with the Deinonychus, and surprisingly, the Carnotaurus backed down. We were on day 98. You were so close to day 100. We were almost there. Later that night, an Allosaurus challenged a Chunkingosaurus to a fight. The Chunkingosaurus had died, and the Allosaurus had won. And it was morning, and the Triceratopses were doing great, and the Deinonychuses were nearly dead. The Nasutoceratops had lost, and the Nasutoceratopses were extinct. The last Chunkingosaurus was lonely, and it was the last of its kind. And the Triceratopses were doing great. And a Carnotaurus challenged a Chunkingosaurus to a fight. Let me be more specific. The last Chunkingosaurus. The Chunkingosaurus had died. The Chunkingosauruses were extinct. It was only a matter of time until the Carnotaurus or the Allosaurus got to the Triceratopses. Later that night, the Deinonychuses were scavenging for food. The Carnotaurus and the Allosaurus were currently at the same kill rate, which means neither one of them was the apex predator. They needed to get into a fight to settle who was the apex predator. Since the Chunkingosaurus' death, the Deinonychuses have been thriving, for they've been feeding off of him. And the Carnotaurus was getting ready to fight the Allosaurus. They've gotten into their fight. Now who will be the apex predator of the ecosystem? The Allosaurus backed down. They would do a rematch later. They've gotten into their rematch fight. Now who will win? The Allosaurus had lost to the Carnotaurus. And we are on night 99. The official apex predator of the ecosystem. The Carnotaurus. Eventually, after day 100, the Deinonychuses would starve to death, for there'd be no more prey left in the ecosystem for the Carnotaurus to kill. And the Allosaurus was officially dead, and the Carnotaurus was sleeping right next to him. But for now, the Deinonychuses would live on, and for now, there will be prey in the ecosystem. And the Deinonychuses were eating the Allosaurus, which means they would at least survive another week. We were on, officially, day 100. We did it. And the only dinosaurs that were left were 2 Deinonychuses, a Carnotaurus, the apex predator of the ecosystem, of course, and 2 Triceratopses. We've made a successful ecosystem by day 100. With herbivores, they lasted to day 50, or to carnivores, they lasted till day 100. We did it all. And I would like to thank you if you watched to this point. So on, folks. Bye.